Hey guys, Matt Gurney here. The Line podcast starts right now. We got lots to talk about today. More Liberal speculation, but this time it's not about the Prime Minister. It's about the Deputy Prime Minister. We're going to tell you all about that in a couple of minutes. NATO summit in Washington, a big announcement, an overdue announcement, but not that big of an announcement, actually. We'll tell you what I mean by that. A Canadian literary icon, Alice Munro, her reputation posthumously went up in a tiny little mushroom cloud this week. And just a couple of quick points on a chilly reception for the Conservative leader at an assembly of Indigenous peoples. And also, God help us, Joe Biden. All that and more on the latest episode of the Line podcast. This episode of the Line podcast has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Canada can be a global leader in reducing the harm caused by smoking, but it requires actionable steps, including giving adult smokers the information they need to choose potentially less harmful alternatives. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
So, Matt, I'm going to make some sounds for you, and you're going to tell me what you hear. Are you ready?
This is frightening, but okay.
It's a little ASMR, but I think you can.
Should I close my eyes or can I watch?
I think that if you close your eyes, you can probably visualize it better. Okay, ready? Beep, 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 beep.
Okay.
Okay, what am I? What am I?
You are a bulldozer?
Close. I'm a bus.
But
That is that is
get
the
it.
sound. That is the sound of a bus beeping up with a little warning in the back, like beep, beep, beep.
Yeah.
Matt, why am I making juvenile bus sounds in our podcast?
There's any number of reasons we would be juvenile on the podcast. But in this particular case, this is the sound that is probably haunting Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's sleep right now, because there are signs that she's about to have that big old Liberal bus pull up behind her so that she can be, and I always have to stress, metaphorically speaking, thrown under it.
And the reason why we are saying that today is if you've been following the podcast for the last 2 weeks, you will know that there was much chatter of a Liberal caucus coup after the devastating loss in St. Paul's, Toronto, by-election loss in St. Paul's, Toronto. We were chatting about the coup, the possibility of the coup. I went long and hard on basically the Liberal caucus doesn't have the guts to pull it off. And my prediction was vindicated.
Garumba.
For 2 weeks after. Garumba, the lack of garumba. For 2 weeks after the loss and all of the chatter about a potential coup, basically it's gone nowhere. I think like 2 Liberal MPs, backbenchers, have come out and saying that Justin Trudeau should step down. We know that the Liberal cabinet made frantic calls, especially to the Toronto caucus, trying to calm everybody down and get everyone back on board. What my read from this was from the beginning was essentially, relatively spineless is probably too harsh a word, but that's the one that's coming to mind at this particular moment. So it's the one we're going to go with. Most of the people in the Liberal caucus, especially the disaffected backbenchers, were going to use the St. Paul's loss as an opportunity to try and shimmy their way up the greasy pole. They were going to try and use it to try and get parliamentary positions. They were going to try and use it to take pot shots at cabinet ministers they didn't like, to try and get them overthrown or shuffled to a bad cabinet. They were going to try and use it if they were on the threshold to try and get a higher profile cabinet position if they can. So they were just going to use rumors of discontent as an opportunity to get FaceTime with the boss and actually try and whittle their way into better positions internally. So that, I think, is exactly what's happened, because, of course, now, several days after our last podcast, what are we hearing? We're hearing cabinet shuffle is probably likely and imminent, probably by summer's end. You can tell who the survivors of the cabinet shuffle are going to be. One of them being, of course, Katie Telford, Trudeau's chief of staff, because it now seems like Telford, or someone around her, someone within the Prime Minister's office, is now leaking to various media sources saying that they are unhappy with the way that Chrystia Freeland, who I will point out has been one of Trudeau's most loyal foot soldiers for several years now. They're unhappy with her inability to effectively communicate the Liberals' glorious economic message and statements.
I have the quote here. Do you want it?
Please. I think now is a good time for it.
Yeah, this is from the Globe and Mail. This article published on the 11th. It was Robert Fife and Marika Walsh. So this is the second graph. There are some quotes in the article, like attributed quotes from either the Prime Minister or members of Ms. Freeland's office rebutting this. But here is the key paragraph from the article. The Globe and Mail reported Thursday that senior officials in the Prime Minister's office, including Chief of Staff Chatty Telford, are concerned about Ms. Freeland's effectiveness in selling the government's economic message at a time when the Liberal government is seeking to revise its political fortunes. So that sounds awfully familiar, right? Like this is something where we've seen this story before. And that was a follow-on later in the day, including the comments from the Prime Minister and Ms. Freeland's office. This was really interesting because the original article in the Globe had been about whether or not Mark Carney would join the government in some way. So the speculation is that Freeland is going to get the boot out of finance, maybe keep the deputy prime minister title, but Mark Carney comes in and then Freeland goes to foreign affairs, which one then has to wonder what happens to Melanie Joly.
Okay, so we have to back up the truck a little bit more because we have to, the bus, yes, because we have to reiterate a previous dent on the bus to explain why this sounds familiar. And that is because this was essentially exactly how Trudeau et al. Managed to oust Bill Morneau, former finance minister. What year was Bill Morneau ousted? I've lost track of time.
2020, 2021.
All of my quantum jumping is starting to mess with me. Anyway, 2020, 2021, thereabouts. So this is when Morneau was always a bit more of a moderate figure within the Liberal caucus. He actually had real business experience. He had real money experience. And I think he was also starting to sound the alarm on some of the Liberal spending, saying, yeah, we can't continue at the current pace and expect things. And of course, that is not what the people at the top wanted to hear. And so what we started to see was something very much like this. It's the same strategy we're seeing right now. It started with a bit of a shock and awe reputation hit, leaking to public sources about problems with Morneau, problems within the cabinet between Trudeau and Morneau. And this was subsequently followed by an unceremonious debooting from the upper echelons of power. And my sense was always that Morneau was never quite happy about the way that happened. It never felt quite like an honorable sort of dismissal. It was a very ugly sort of walking of the plank.
His eventual book did not rain praise on his former boss.
It did not. So it's interesting to see that we're seeing not quite as harsh. I don't think that the leaks coming from the Prime Minister's office is quite as harsh as what was happening with Morneau, but we're seeing a similar kind of tactic. There's a public sort of seeding of the ground, getting people ready to what seems to me they're going to try and pin all of this government's problems on Freeland, and then they're going to fire him. So there's an attempt to sort of make Freeland into a scapegoat of the Liberal government's problems in order to preserve what's left of the team. And in this case, the team being sort of Trudeau and Telford. And that, I think it's like, honestly, I think that's the strategy. I think what makes this really off-putting for a lot of insiders and a lot of people who watch politics is that, as I said earlier, Freeland has been one of Trudeau's most loyal ministers and supporters and members of his cabinet. She's been out there. She's eaten a hell of a lot of shit for this government and this government's choices, some of which I'm sure were not her choices, but she went out and defended anyway. So to see her sort of wind up being the sacrificial lamb for all of this, I think is hard for people to swallow, unless, of course, she's doing it voluntarily because she knows she doesn't really want to run and be in politics anymore. It's also very possible that she's taking one final knife in the gut for her boss before she wants. You know what I mean? That's a possibility, but it certainly doesn't feel quite like that. Now, what I think is interesting about the quote that you just read earlier is that at no point do the people leaking to the Globe and Mail stop to consider maybe Chrystia Freeland can't sell your economic policies because your economic policies are kind of suck and are out of touch with where most Canadians really are. It's always again, it goes back to the blame the messenger, the problems, the communications. If only we were communicating how great we were better, the people would fall back in line. again, it falls back into that problem. And I think that just fundamentally misses the tone shift. It misses the attitudinal shifts that are happening. And I think it's missing the reality of what Canadians are facing on the ground, what they want their governments to prioritize and focus on. And I think that they can't get themselves out of their 2015 hopey changey mindy headset, right? Mindset. So that's where my take is on that. The fact that the Trudeau government is now simultaneously openly signaling that they're welcoming Mark Carney into the fold in public actually indicates something else to me, and that is they haven't convinced him yet. My guess is that this is all happening very much in public because Trudeau is trying to get Carney to fish or cut bait. I think that they're trying to do this publicly, and they're trying to make a show of this publicly. They're laying out the welcome mat publicly as an influence campaign.
I have so many thoughts on this, and the reason I have so many thoughts on this is because I'm a little bit unclear as to what's happening. So let me give you the first ambiguity. The first is that this could be exactly as you've said. This could be the preparing of the ground for the purging of Chrystia Freeland, where she'll get blown out of the airlock. It could also be a genuine leak. It could be conversations in the PMO about what do we do that somebody spilled. I don't know. Also, I've been saying the Liberal caucus has no garumba. I think Chrystia Freeland has some garumba. I think she's probably one of the few people in the cabinet who actually is confident that her next job is going to be just as cool and probably infinitely better paying than her current one. A lot of Trudeau's cabinet, I think, are probably hitting their career peaks right about now. Freeland is going to bounce to the IMF or a think tank or the UN. Freeland's going to be fine. So I could easily see Freeland going in a couple weeks, you know what, fuck it, I'm done. And she takes her red dress and she leaves. She's gone. So that's one thought where I just don't know, where I don't know what they're doing and I don't know how she's going to react to it. The other thing you've noted that it's not as blunt as it was with Morneau. I think it's because the government knew Morneau would go nowhere else. He was not going to suddenly become like the heritage minister, right? Like he was going to be the finance minister or he was going to quit government. And that's exactly what happened. Is it possible that Freeland decides not to take her ball and go home, but she remains deputy prime minister and becomes foreign affairs minister, and then Jolie goes and does something else? Maybe. So that could be why the tone is different. They might not want to get rid of her entirely.
She's too valuable as a cabinet minister to risk losing altogether.
Yes, but also it won't look good if Trudeau purges another powerful woman.
Yeah.
So there are risks for the PM here. A couple other kind of, like I said, my thoughts on this are a little bit disjointed. I'm kind of with you on the Carney stuff. Like, it's not clear to me that Carney wants to run in the next election. It's not clear to me that he wants to get in now. I don't know. I haven't talked to the guy. I don't know the guy. But if I was advising him, my advice, and this is very neutral advice to him, wait. Speak, tour the country, get to know the grassroots guys, get to know the money guys, not the like central bank money, but like the Liberal Party money.
Yeah.
Be the hero the day after the next election. Come in, rebuild the party.
If our instincts are right here, and Freeland is about to be blamed for all the government's woes just before she's essentially unceremoniously demoted or moved. This government now has a track record of like doing this to finance ministers
and women.
You want to be the next guy? You want to be the next Morneau? Like, I don't think that Carney needs to serve as finance minister in order to make a credible run for prime minister.
I think
and I don't think he's
not.
I think he's better off not. Yeah, I think he's better off totally distancing himself from everybody running the party right now and coming in on a fresh slate.
On day two after the next election.
Yes, somebody who's been Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor does not benefit at all from a CV that also includes the word finance minister on it.
In a government that's about to get blown out.
In a government that's about to get blown out. Now you have him win a grassroots party fight. You have him rebuild a team. You have him spend a couple years in the trenches in opposition. Now you've got someone who's demonstrated enough political savvy to actually make a credible run for prime minister.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Can Mark Carney pass the marshmallow test? Is I think the underlying theme of the week here? And the answer is, I don't actually know. We'll see. We'll see what he does.
There's one other point to make, though, and I find this one the most, honestly, this was my immediate take. So I got up, I read my morning Globe and Mail with my cup of Earl Grey, and I was reading this article about the PMO. Like, I read the quote already. Oh, well, you know, the economic messaging. If the PMO is disappointed in how Chrystia Freeland has been messaging, communicating the government's economic plans, there is one entity that is to blame for the PMO's disappointment, and it's the fucking PMO. Yeah. Because Freeland apparently is very good at being a minister. She's good at quiet behind-the-scenes negotiations. She was effective working with provincial premiers, effective working with the Americans under the Trump White House. But you know what she's not effective at? Talking to normal human beings.
Correct. As we have stated bluntly in earlier podcasts.
So you took, like, honestly, it's sort of like, well, this robot is really good at math, but its language programming isn't good. And we're going to make it a communicator. And then it fails. And you're like, well, the robot didn't do what it was supposed to. Chrystia Freeland has strengths. She's very good at some stuff, according to every report. If you are blaming her for being ineffective at messaging retail politics and pocketbook issues to the average Canadian, that is not a reflection on her failures. It's a reflection on your failure for putting her in that situation.
Yeah.
Wrong tool for the job.
Well, and also potentially, could she be better with the correct supports, right? With the correct, I don't know.
No.
Maybe not. No. I don't know. Like, I don't know.
No.
But she's bad at it. No, she's, I mean, I remember it wasn't so long ago when people, especially liberal diehards, were still absolutely hell-bent on the idea that Chrystia Freeland was going to be a replacement for Justin Trudeau, until suddenly everybody finally came to the inevitable realization that her retail political skills simply were not there, and that were never going to be there. They could not be trained into her. You know, she could potentially be a great second in command for a lot of different people, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way. Being second in command is a hard job. It's actually arguably in some ways harder job than being first in command. Like, there's a role there, and understanding where your skills are and where your skills aren't, and serving in that role is a gift, right?
I've been the commander, and I've been the 2IC, and 2IC is much harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
So
a good deputy is indispensable.
Good deputy is totally indispensable, and I think that she, for all we know, I mean, again, we don't have insight into the back rooms of Parliament here, or only limited insight into the back room of Parliament, because we're not MPs, we're not in that caucus. But for all we know, let's just take it on assumption that she's a fantastic deputy, she's a fantastic number two. Her retail political skills are lacking. Unfortunately, to be number one, your retail political skills cannot be lacking. It's just your instincts and your ability to communicate with people need to be talked to. That doesn't mean that you're good at everything else. And a good leader understands what their skills are and what their skills aren't, and actually delegates to their weaknesses. That, I think, is actually one of the prevailing failures of the Prime Minister's office to date. But
yeah, you know, I was actually about to say that's been a perennial failure of this government, because you talked a couple minutes ago about how there was a time when there was the whole sense that Freeland was the natural successor. And I've described it here and elsewhere as the cult of the girl boss. Like, there was this weird vibe around Freeland, and not Freeland herself, but people around her. And I was the asshole on the outside going, I don't know, she sounds like a hectoring kindergarten teacher. And like, she doesn't communicate well to Canadians. And like that, every time I would say that, I'd get like my head taken off, like just totally bitten right off. It's a fascinating arc for Chrystia Freeland. It really genuinely is. But I'm not shocked to find her here. She's not good at the retail side. And if that's what they wanted her to do, that was their fault. They put her in a weird position. Can I say one other thing, though, about Freeland? An observation I've made in the last couple of months. There have been obvious signs of the stress of the current political situation bubbling up for certain cabinet ministers. I think the Prime Minister in general has handled it quite well. I think he is borne up well under the stress of what has got to be a difficult period in time for him. He's had personal life struggles, and he's handled with grace and aplomb. He has not lost his cool, politically speaking. Some of his ministers have been like visibly melting down. Freeland has not been coping well with the last few months. It is possible that right now that there's just a growing frustration with her because, we had those comments not long ago of our headline was based on it, like cold, cruel, and small, or whatever that was. And then there was the whole, if we don't slightly, Jen's got a party going on behind her. If there was not like a slightly tweaked capital gains tax inclusion rate, teenagers will be pregnant and the living will envy the dead. And we had another minister, Mr. Holland, like your family road trip will ignite the atmosphere and destroy life as we know it.
So anyway, there's one other observation I would make, and one is I was writing a column while I was being screamed at by children for the Walrus, and hopefully that will come out unless they hate it, which they might, because again, I was being screamed at by children.
Every other paragraph, shut the fuck up, mommy's working.
Exactly, right?
Whoops, dictation got that. Didn't catch that one in editing.
But in the midst of it, I asked for some research from Ipsos, which is one of the better polling firms here in Canada. I quite like the Ipsos guys. And they sent me some interesting data that was compiled back in April, looking at sort of the state of Canadians and looking at things like social cohesion and where attitudes are at. And they've pinpointed two really interesting things in this data. Maybe we'll write about it in the dispatch. Maybe this is going to be a blurb as well. Two interesting things in the data. One, the degree of the post-pandemic attitude of Canadians has done a very radical shift. We used to be much more collectivist, much more optimistic. Mm-hmm. Post-pandemic, we are no longer have as much faith in our institutions to function. And firstly, we're much less optimistic, so we're much more aware that catastrophes and bad things can happen, and we have less faith in our governments and institutions to handle those catastrophes effectively. There's been a pretty radical decline in institutional trust, and this is reflected in a higher degree of individualism and autonomy, and sort of a reprioritizing individualism and autonomy as values. As well as
guilty as charged in my case. I'm not doing it the same way ever again.
Yep. And then the other thing that is also noticing is that this is starting to be reflected in other kinds of behaviors, like a decline in volunteerism, decline in voting, like decline in sort of collectivized behaviors is starting, and donating to charity is one of the other ones that has been in decline. And I would also stress that those might also be indicators of economic stress as well. But it also aligns with this attitudinal shift. And the attitudinal shift, I think, is also very interesting because it reflects a lot of the momentum that we're seeing behind the conservative movement, right? A lot of these attitudes are much more conservatively, I think they're much more comfortable with conservative values than they are with more liberal progressive values. So there's been a shift in attitudes on a lot of different fronts. And then the other interesting thing that's come out of this research is looking at the exact date when these attitude shifts started to notice an appreciable fall off a cliff, right? It was June of 2023. So it wasn't COVID exactly. So what happened was that all of these sorts of metrics were declining under the Liberal government since 2015. Like all of these sorts of faith in government, social cohesion, concern with what was going on, all of that was on a decline. COVID hit.
Can you see a visible bend during the pandemic?
Well, no, it went the opposite direction during the pandemic. There was a very, very sudden, very marked restoring of social cohesion and social trust right when the pandemic hits. And of course, this is also right when the checks are coming in from government. So everybody's getting paid. We're in lockdown. People are sort of messed up, but like there's a sense of coming together. And a result of this, you also saw this, for example, in Justin Trudeau's approval ratings, and a lot of provincial leadership approval ratings had this like COVID bump because we have been conditioned in a society that in the midst of crisis, we band together, right? We come together. It's not a time for divisiveness. It's not a time for this. So there's a coming togetherness vibe of it. But that peak, that jump, only lasts so long, and then it starts to go down again. And by around June 2023, that's when we're on the downward trajectory that we would have been had the COVID pandemic not happened. So prior to the pandemic, what happens is we're starting to recognize that there are fundamental problems in the way things are working. Things are not quite gelling the way they're supposed to gelling. People can sense it. They can feel it. The quality of life just isn't quite there. The pandemic hits. Everybody immediately goes, crisis, come together. And then the pandemic starts to unravel that sense of cohesion, coming together vibe over time. And then by about June 2023, we're enough past the pandemic that the hangover starts to hit, the hangover from the party. And that is when we start to notice the real drop, the real changes in attitudinal shifts. This is, for example, when the youngest generations start to become more and more pessimistic. This is when we're starting to notice real shifts in sort of faith in government institutions and ability to handle crises. It wasn't 2021.
Pierre Poilievre starts leading with millennials.
And it's when Pierre Poilievre starts leading with millennials. I think this is also the moment when you start to see interest rates go up, grocery bills start to go up really significantly. But I remember back in June 2023, you and I both had this sense like this is starting to feel death spiral territory with the Liberals, right? And it's not just the Liberals where these attitudinal shifts are happening. It's not just federal politics. It's right across the board. It's municipal, it's provincial, there's a whole thing happening society-wide. But there's a real shift in attitudes that start to happen, and it takes root in June 2023, and it never comes back. And it's just been getting worse and worse and worse. The trend lines on all of these attitudinal stuff are getting worse and worse and worse and worse every successive month. So this is something that I think the Liberals haven't wrapped their heads around. And this is why I think it's really, really hard for them to pivot, because they are the avatars of a much more optimistic
status quo.
Of a status quo. And also they're the avatars of a much more optimistic time, right? The Canada of 2015 is not Canada of 2019 and is certainly not Canada of 2024. These are very different electors.
Mitch Heupel wrote that column for us, right? Like the last of the Obama-era leaders. It's down to Macron, barely, and Trudeau.
Yep. So we're seeing a lot of that sort of stuff happen. And I think there's a way that this is fermenting in my head, and I'll probably write a column about it at some point because it's very interesting stuff. But yeah. Anyway, Liberals, what are you going to do?
That sounds like, is that you forwarded me an email a while ago with a bunch of information.
That was the data.
I will, when you sent it to me, I was like, data, I don't want to read it. It's July, but it actually does sound interesting.
It is interesting, and also it all comes with a happy infographics. So I mean, they know how to talk to journalists there at Ipsos.
Here is a bright, colorful,
shiny picture with graphics and graphs
and a snack.
And we're not going to make you do too much math, I promise.
Oh, they know
us well.
Well, like and subscribe. This episode of the Line Podcast has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and regulations, today nearly 5 million Canadian adults smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. Right now, accessing information about these options is heavily restricted in Canada. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco and vaping products provide a potentially less harmful choice than cigarettes. Cigarettes burn tobacco, resulting in smoke that contains 6,000 harmful chemicals that are associated with smoking-related disease and death. Heated tobacco and vaping products have the potential to significantly reduce this risk. Health agencies around the world are now considering these alternatives to help end smoking. Updated laws can help adult smokers better understand the full range of options available, including the relative risks of these products. Millions of Canadians smoke cigarettes. Technology exists that can help change that, but policymakers need to take actions. Learn more about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at unsmoke.ca. I should have mentioned, we screwed up the like and subscribe there. I wanted to just mention to you one thing before I move on to NATO. You were talking about the decline in faith in institutions, institutional trust, and you also mentioned charitable donations, which I thought was really, really interesting. Speaking just for myself here, I am much less engaged as a citizen than I was a few years ago because I've largely given up on a lot of things, and I've very much taken the attitude of I'm out for myself, my family, and my closest friends. Like I can't protect the rest of you, so I'm going to focus on what I can. You know what's interesting though? I donate more to charity now. I'm guilt offsetting. So I feel bad that I've taken a much more overtly selfish, mercenary, I'm in it for me and mine attitude, but I've upped my charitable giving to particularly either international or local organizations that provide for people who are in distress. And it's just, to me, like it's guilt money for me. It is 100% guilt money.
See, and this is something that I think is actually interesting and that I would note for people who are a little bit in the F Canada train. And that is, aside. There's a show called Preppers. I think I forget what it's called, but it's like a Preppers type show where it's a reality TV thing where they go into all of these preppers bunkers and talk about why they're prepping, what they're prepping for, what their survival looks like, what's their bug out capability. And I find this stuff fascinating, in part because it's a species of insanity that I can relate to very deeply, you know. But at the same time, one thing that a lot of the preppers have in common is this just a fatally individualistic bent. This idea that if I can store enough freeze-dried food in my basement, I'll be fine. My family will be fine. Without an understanding that's not how societies work. It's not how societies have ever worked. The nuclear family doesn't function outside of a very particular type of context. And if, you know, the disaster strikes and the meteor hits, the EMF wave, you know, destroys all of human civilization.
Just before you get killed, it's EMP.
Sorry, EMP. There you go.
Commenters be all over you on that one.
I apologize. I apologize to all the preppers out there. Look, it's not going to be the nuclear family with 3 years worth of food in the basement that survives. No, the people who are going to survive are the people who can radically create a tribe of potentially half a dozen to 24 people who can then go raid those families' basements, right? When things go really sideways, you know, don't look to. You kind of have to look to something beyond your individual capability, though that's part of it. And you certainly can't necessarily trust very large bureaucracies to manage things. But the people who do well understand that their greatest security lies within their immediate community. Yeah. Right? It's your neighbors. Yeah. It's your neighbors. It's your ability to, can I call 20 people on the phone and get them to my house?
To help me pitch a barn or to pass out rifles to drive off the bandits.
To put together a community farm, to dig a well, to do those sorts of people. Can I get 20 to 30 people on a day's notice at my house, and we do something that it takes groups of people to actually do together to function.
There are prepping communities, like there are
and those ones
they'd have a fighting chance.
Those ones I would give a fighting chance. The problem is that a lot of those prepping communities are going to be taken over by me and my husband and our little tribe, who will come in with the rifles and become their kings and queens. So, like, you know, I mean, that's just you know, it's a brutal, survival's a brutal business. I'm not cheering for the end of civilization, but
I can tell you've been thinking about the end of civilization because you've got a plan.
I've got.
No, we're not going to remember the commune. We're going to seize the commune.
Matt, I've got regalia. It's great. No, but the thing I would say is that I'm not suggesting that Canadians should be preppers. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that if you are losing faith in large bureaucracies and institutions to serve you appropriately, or you're feeling disconnected from your ability to solve problems in our political system, one of the more productive ways you can turn, instead of going full-on individualist nihilist, one of the more productive paths you can turn to is your immediate community. It's your immediate church group, your hobby groups, your local community associations. Like, become active in those local groups, and that, I think, is a much more productive way of funneling some of that nihilism and that dread. Anyway, just a thought.
I think you're bang on. I mean, just even from a pure survival perspective, a lot of these preppers own multiple guns, but they've only got one trigger finger. Like, so yeah, you need an army to survive. All right, speaking of armies, I wrote a column about this on Friday, so I don't think I need to belabor the point, but I was writing about the good and the bad news about Canadian military spending. In Washington this week, the alliance leaders gathered for a NATO summit, and the Prime Minister was there, and the timing was weird. I kind of suspect they were forced into it by political pressure from allies, and particularly Americans, but the Prime Minister said that we do, in fact, now have a plan to reach 2% of GDP, which is the agreed upon NATO target. Okay, that's good. And as I said in the column, there have been some recent procurements, not just announcements, but actual procurements. That's good. Thumbs up. Give credit for that. I also give the government credit for reversing the long-term decline in Canadian defense spending. Under Justin Trudeau, defense spending has been coming up, and I give him credit for that as well. What I don't give him credit for is a plan to hit 2% in 2032. It's just not a serious plan. If an 8-year time horizon. It took us 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine to even come up with a plan, to have a plan. It's like, this is not serious. I understand the political purpose it serves, but I don't think it's going to work. I don't think our allies are going to be like, oh, the Canadians are on their way to hitting the target by 2032. There's also a couple pragmatic problems with this. First of all, by 2032, I'm not convinced 2% is the target. It could be 2.5%. It could be 3%. Our European allies are getting freaked out. The Europeans are figuring this out faster than we are, and they're responding accordingly. I think the other problem is the Prime Minister, during his press conference in Washington, he had some comments that I would describe. Again, I've already given him credit for some of what's been accomplished here, but I think his comments were a bit petulant. You know, he was asked about the 2% target and why didn't we, like, there are things we could do from an accounting perspective. We could relabel certain things as defense spending, and our contributions would go up. Like if we considered the Coast Guard part of the military, if we arm the Coast Guard, boom, the Coast Guard budget now falls into the defense spending. And the Prime Minister, I think, made a really logical argument against that. I think he made a great case that, no, we're not going to cook the books. We're not going to fake it till we make it. Like, we're actually going to make real defense investments. And I think that's I think he was right. But the problem is there's a lot of things he could be doing that he's not doing. So if you want to make the case that, no, we're going to be laser focused on real tangible defense commitments, we're not going to be cooking the books, then why are you doing the things? Why are you pledging to do the things in 8 years? When Justin Trudeau will be well into his retirement years by then, no matter what happens in the next election. It's not, if you want to go out there and criticize those calling on you doing the easy, cheap things, I want to know why you aren't doing the easy, real things. You want to know the fastest things we could do to goose defense spending in the short term? Revitalize military infrastructure. Like, our bases are decrepit. Our base housing is decrepit. Announce a multi-billion-dollar fund to renovate and retrofit every Canadian Forces base in this country and dramatically expand on-base housing, and to do it in 4 years. That's billions of dollars that would be helping. It would bring up our numbers. It would satisfy our NATO allies, and it would make us a more capable military, and our soldiers would live in better accommodations. So, like, if you want to say, no, we're not going to do the cheap and easy things, fine. Do the real things, the fast things, and the important things. And not being willing to do that while also, like, trying to portray yourself as the hero who's avoiding the cheats bothered me. But the other thing that bothered me was how the PM took a kind of he gave this answer. I thought it was mostly a good answer, but he took a little bit of a swipe at the 2% target. He's like, well, the figure that some people are so quick to rush to. With all due respect, Prime Minister, I'm not asking you, and our allies are not asking you, and Donald Trump, future president of the United States, based on current trend lines, no one is asking the Prime Minister to do anything that he is not committed to do. And this is the thing that pisses me off about this. Canadian governments, including this government, as part of past NATO summits, have committed to the 2% target. I don't, like, it's kind of a shitty thing to do, to commit to the target and then shit talk it.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to propose a different target, propose a different target. What is the proposed target you would prefer to see, sir? How would you prefer this be calculated? Like, this is what we agreed to. We've talked about this and how annoying this is. I mean, I think some of the petulance can be explained by the fact that our allies are now getting increasingly vocal and, more importantly, public.
Yeah, and they're embarrassing it.
Yeah, they're embarrassed. Yeah. There was an article in Politico this week where some of our allies were very open about giving Canada hell for being wildly behind our allies, even though we are increasing our defense spending, but it's not close to enough, and it's not by enough to fail to notice that there's this growing gap starting to happen. But I mean, Matt, just to play devil's advocate, okay, so we don't get to the 2% target that we've committed to. What you going to do about it? What are allies going to do about it? I mean, they can embarrass us publicly. They can send nasty grams to us through Politico, which is what they do.
We'll find our influence waning. That's what I guess. But I mean,
it's already waned. It's already gone, right?
Worse is always possible.
Well, sure. I mean, we're already seeing the consequences of what waning influence means for us geopolitically when we run into trouble, right? Or we're just not at the table anymore. We're increasingly not part of the network of decision makers that actually make stuff happen globally. Nobody really cares about what we think. And I think that actually the consequence is going to come through trade deals. Increasingly, we're just going to find ourselves iced out of trade deals. And iced out of potentially lucrative and quality of life enhancing trade deals by people who just say you're laggards on the system. You're laggards on the global system. Screw you.
It could
that
be
starts
more
to
dramatic
play out in really weird ways.
It could be a re-elected Donald Trump hitting any NATO country that is below 2% with a 10% import tariff.
Sure.
Like this is something that is being discussed in certain circles in Ottawa. It's something we are worried about. It would be called a protectorate tax. Okay, you're not pulling your weight. We will protect you, but we're going to crush your exporters. And
I actually don't even, as catastrophic as that would be for Canada, and how much would that, we deserve it.
Yep. No, and that's, I mean, strip away all the politics, strip away even all the policy on a basic moral, ethical level. Canada is a freeloader, and we don't have to be. This is a choice we've made. We are rich enough, and we are capable of deciding what our priorities are and what our priorities aren't. We have decided, and we never had like a big vote on it. It wasn't like a put to the people in a yes or no proposition. But the collective sum of the choices we have made is that we are going to spend money on spoiling ourselves at home while neglecting obligations abroad. Mm-hmm. And we got away with that for a while because the times were good, but they're not anymore. And, I already quoted Naked Gun in my column today. I'm going to quote it again here in the podcast. The cows have come home to roost. This is... We were flaky and we were lazy and we were self-indulgent and we were selfish. And we preened on the moral stage talking about backpackers in Europe putting a maple leaf on their knapsack and also moralized toward other people in terms of their democracies, toward their issues with women, toward abortion access. I mean, we're absolute moral nannies on the world stage, but we don't back it up. While chronically and critically underfunding things that would make a tangible difference to the safety and prosperity of our allies and to people around the world. We talk our token 6-month in and out peacekeeping mission in Mali that allowed Trudeau to say we've done a peacekeeping mission. If we'd stayed, we would have been able to help vulnerable people, but that wasn't what we were there to do. We were there to tick a box.
Right.
We deserve the moral condemnation of our allies because we have let them down. And that historically had not been what Canada has done, but it is what we have become.
On that note, like and subscribe. Like and subscribe.
All right. A couple items, Jen, on our list. We don't want to devote a whole topic to them, but it's just some things we wanted to mention. I want to mention up front, and then, well, you know what? You were keen to talk Alice Munro. Why don't you talk that first? I'll get to my point in a minute. But
look, I think I'm probably going to write a column on Alice Munro, in part because occasionally I do like to delve into cultural issues, and it is summer. So, for those who may not be aware, Alice Munro is a Canadian literary icon, has been for many years, recently died, and her daughter came out with a piece in the Toronto Star, essentially saying, my stepfather sexually abused me. I told my mother, Munro's husband. And not only did Munro not take the daughter's side and leave the husband, kind of actively tried to actually blame the daughter for her own victimization, kind of claimed to be, claimed that the daughter essentially was out to humiliate her, was a homewrecker.
Well, my husband cheated on me with you, my child.
Yeah, my 9-year-old here is when this abuse started, right? Real piece of work the husband appears to be. He's also dead, so we don't need to worry about libeling him now.
Oh, and he was
today, and he was convicted. Yeah. He was not sentenced remotely appropriately, to my mind. He's a relatively minor sentence, but I mean, that's Canada for you. And it looks like also a piece has come out now in the Toronto Star from the OPP officer, one of the OPP officers who investigated the case and claimed that Munro told him, the police officer, that her daughter was lying. And this, despite the fact that, basically there's written evidence accordingly. I mean, not written evidence that I've seen, but there's written evidence from the husband here saying, yes, I abused your daughter. She made me do it. Like, you know what I mean? Like there doesn't seem to be any credible dispute that this happened.
When he was eventually charged, he did plead guilty.
Yeah, he pled guilty.
Yeah.
So even if he were alive, we would have no libel concerns on this stuff. We don't have to say allegedly at this point. So obviously this is deeply horrific, and this has forced this kind of candlelit reckoning. How should this? I think that we in Canada have this tendency to believe ourselves to be really nice, and therefore our icons will be nice.
Well, it's
I think
the same
that's
minute ago, right? It's the same maple leaf on the backpack.
That's really dumb. I'm not here to defend Alice Munro. That she sounds like a horrific human being who happened to create some really interesting and excellent short stories.
But she's not un-Canadian. She's just human.
She's just human, right? And a pretty nasty human by the sounds of it.
A lot of humans are nasty.
A lot of humans are nasty. It's what it is. So I don't know. I think we have to get over this fixation of Canadianness as being something inherently nice. We're not. I keep on saying to these people, Canadians aren't nice. We're polite. There's a difference. Anyway, I'm just going to scream at my children on that.
Well, it kind of jumps out at me while you're screaming at your kids. I would say there's two angles to this. There is the Canadians are shocked to find out that Canadians have the same pathologies and moral failings as every other human society. This is something we talked about this years ago in the context of the graves at former residential school sites, or the ground radar scans, possible grave sites, where we talked about there was this bizarre recoiling Canadian response to this. It's like, what, you thought colonialism in Canada was nicer than it was in other places? The Canadians are nice. Kool-Aid has been drunk so deeply by Canadians themselves that when they discover that the normal and horrific, but like common throughout human history, failures of either individuals or states happened in their country, they're shocked. I thought we were nicer than this. And you're a fucking idiot.
We never seem to learn either. No. We keep on going through this, like, I can't believe that this could have, like, I did send a note to Margaret Atwood and said, look, when we find the baby corpses in your yard, that's really going to throw the Canadian literary establishment for a loop.
That's dark. I like it, but it's dark.
She had a good sense of humor about it. Anyway,
one thing I'll just add to that. I wonder, so I think the Canadian angle is legit, but also, what is it with people who invest moral virtue in artists whose work they like?
Well, and that's actually the thing that I want to make, is the point I want to make is essentially art is about transgressing moral limits, the society's taboos and moral limits, experiencing those transgressions and then reporting back to the normies. That's a huge part of what art actually is. The idea, if you're looking for morality in art, you're not really looking for art. You're looking for propaganda. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking for propaganda, might I suggest the church, and sometimes not even there. This is not a place for nice people, and it's particularly not a nice place for if you're interested in writers and writing, because most writers have narcissistic complexes. In fact, that's part of what makes writers, particularly autobiographical or autobiographically based writers, fascinating. We find narcissists and sociopathy really fascinating in the same way we find watching tornadoes really fascinating, right?
I wake up every morning convinced that hundreds of thousands of people want to know what I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a degree of just you're not mentally well to do this job. Like, you can't be totally mentally well. But that lack of stability, that lack of normality is part of what makes good writers good, and part of what makes them interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think to some extent we all have moral failings, and I don't think I would have made the mistakes that Alice Munro made. I don't think that I'm like that. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but I've never been confronted with that scenario. But part of what, if you look at popular writers in any country, and especially Canadian writers, look at the ones that have this weird train wreck, fascinated quality to them, and they're all narcissists, man. I mean, they just are, to a lesser or greater degree. I mean, you and I, all humans are narcissists to a lesser or greater degree, but we all rank, like we're all on this particular spectrum.
Yeah, none of us are a zero.
None of us are a zero. You couldn't possibly be a zero and do the job. So it's an interesting issue, and I see a lot of there's Alice Munro's persona, but when you start to peel back some of the things that Alice Munro was accused of saying, incredibly accused of saying and doing,
it's bad.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh boy, a lot.
We'll move on after this, but I have a friend who's a Hollywood writer, has made her career writing screenplays, and she's done very well at it. She's had a very successful life. One of the things that she had told me once, I thought was such an interesting insight. I was like, tell me about Hollywood people. She goes, all the Hollywood people are the same. She goes, the ones who are different are the ones who work in Hollywood but live on an 8,000 acre ranch in Wyoming. She goes, those are the ones who come in and they have a passion for the craft. They have talent for it. They make huge money, but they also have that sense of self-preservation to get out, to fly into LA, to get like that nice hotel suite paid for by the studio, to do the 8 to 12 week movie shoot, thank everybody, go to the wrap party, and then they're back to the ranch where their agent does all their communicating for them, where they're not in the celebrity culture of fawning self-adulation. And she goes, those are the ones who will survive. She says the other type that survives are the ones who grew up working hard and had that first hit series or movie in their 40s, because they're the ones who still live in the condo and drive the Honda. And after they pay their agent fees, all their money goes into a retirement fund. She says the ones that are the worst people are the ones who have an early hit success. They think that's normal. And then they spend the rest of their life chasing that. So anyway.
Heroin. Yeah. Anyway, it's an interesting thing, but it's I mean, I don't think that you would compare any of these people, including Munro or myself or you, Hollywood people. I think it's a different mindset. But the Canadian literary scene is a pretty small and insular sort of place. But I'm still working on my thoughts on this one. I think I'm going to do a column. I don't think I'm going to do a dispatch on this one. It's a good summer column to sort of chew over a bit. I'm not interested in engaging in the moral outrage, and I realize that there's also a sense of, well, I guess I can't read Alice Munro now because she's a terrible person. I'm going like, oh, that's not. No, this information should inform the way you read Alice Munro. A lot of the types of stories and issues she gets into around familial guilt and betrayal and all that sort of stuff is a much more colorful and informed conversation if you understand that she herself lives in a lot of those morally murky and nebulous spaces. But no, I think that the people who expect art to be done by moral people have a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of art and the people who make it. And what it does for a society and what it's supposed to do for a society. So anyway, that's just kind of my early fermenting thoughts, but I don't want to give too much away here.
No, that's fine. A couple other just roundup points. Pierre Poilievre giving a speech this week at the Assembly of First Nations and having a muted response, we could put it. Not a ton of applause from my understanding. And also some people walked out on his speech. Others turned their back on him. It's not my place to tell the Assembly of First Nations how to respond to any given politician, but I just thought it was, as a matter of strategy, I thought it was interesting because I've been thinking, I was talking with a polling friend of mine earlier in the week. He's been looking closely at Quebec's numbers, where the Conservatives have shown some life, but still not a ton. And one of the things I'd said to my buddy, a pollster, was that if we're getting close to the election date and it's like Bloc, Liberals, Conservatives, but the Conservatives are basically going to sweep the rest of the country, I made my prediction that Quebec swings Conservative because they'll want in. Quebec voters have historically been very good at the strategic calculation of, do we want a racontant, noisy opposition like the Bloc, which they have done, or do we want to stampede into the Conservatives and get like a strong Quebec caucus within a victorious Conservative party? You know, Indigenous peoples in Canada are a growing share of the population, and in many places, thank God, they are increasingly affluent. I'm not trying to say mission accomplished, but there are a lot of Indigenous communities in this country that are beginning, thank God, to actually thrive. And I'm wondering what they're going to do with their political power, because do they want in on a Poilievre government? Do they want leverage on a Poilievre government, or do they want to be apart from it? I don't know, and I would actually be fascinated to see some pieces written by Indigenous political or economic leaders on that front. But I just thought it was interesting because you and I have talked about this in different contexts already. As a Conservative victory becomes more certain and closer, different elements in society are going to need to decide what that means for them and how to position themselves. So I wonder at next year's Assembly of First Nations, if Mr. Poilievre goes back, I wonder how that speech will be received.
So I've got a different, slightly more different take on this one. And that one is, firstly, if people of the Assembly of First Nations feel the need to turn their back on the Conservative leader, or the Liberal leader, or the NDP leader, whatever, totally cool. You're right. That is a totally reasonable and acceptable way to express your distaste, your disgust, your disagreement with the policies of that leader, the government, anything like that. Fair enough.
He specifically has some baggage on that front.
Yeah, exactly. Fair play to you. Okay. No shade is coming forth from my way. And to me, I think that communicates pretty clearly that the Conservatives have a lot of bridges to build and a lot of work to do to build connections with those communities. However, what I found interesting is firstly, how strategically wise that is a different conversation. And as you noted, do you want to be alienating the future prime minister right out of the gate before he's had a chance to do anything? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. That's your call. The fear that I would have is that by doing something like that, the message you're actually communicating to the Conservatives is that these people aren't on your side and there isn't any point in dealing with them because there's nothing that you can do to get them on your side. So that would be my concern strategically with a move like that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a wrong thing to do. The other move might be is that this actually will inspire some people within the Conservative movement to realize that significant work needs to be done to build those relationships.
I hope so.
You could go either way on that one. The other thing that I thought was interesting is when you ask people, okay, why specifically are you turning your back on Pierre Poilievre's individual baggage aside? The answers that you got was, well, he failed to acknowledge missing and murdered Indigenous women.
I'm going to quote here.
Tell me the quote.
So this was so when I saw that he'd had his backs turned on him, I didn't know why. And I read all the coverage about it. And this was kind of as close as I came. This is from Global News. This is a direct quote from a Global News article. Chief Judy Wilson of Surrey, BC, called out Poilievre for not mentioning the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, or anything about climate change.
Okay, so here's my observation. Okay, and you can take it or leave it. One is that mentioning the UN rights of Indigenous people and missing and murdered Indigenous girls, some movement has obviously been taking. We've had a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry in Canada. Recommendations have been made from that inquiry, but mentioning these things has become a kind of ritual act of piety. Okay, for a lot of Canadians who are in Indigenous spaces. Of course, they're going to mention this. Of course, they're going to abnegate. They're going to do all these things. They're going to do the land acknowledgements, all these sorts of things. Pierre Poilievre is not going to self-abnegate. He's not going to come into any room and spout pious stuff that he doesn't actually think serves him or the audience appropriately. Now, whether or not he does or doesn't, that's not for me to decide. He's not going to do that. He's not going to engage in what I would call the ritual pieties of Canadian politics. That's why so many, especially white progressive liberals, find him so off-putting. So people in First Nations communities have a choice. They can prioritize, they can work with a conservative government to focus on the places where values and outcomes align and agree to disagree on places where values and outcomes do not align and try to turn that into a productive relationship as much as that is possible. Or they can continue to align themselves with people who say the right things and engage in the right pieties and do the correct genuflections and motions and do nothing.
And then lose an election.
I mean, but even when the people who say the right things are in power, I would ask, are you getting the outcomes that you need from those people in power? They say the right things. Mm-hmm. They've done the inquiries. They genuflect at the church. Do they do the right thing? Are your material circumstances better as a result of those pieties? I can't assess that for people who are First Nations in this country because I'm not a First Nations person and I live in suburban Calgary. I can't assess whether or not First Nations people's quality of life on the whole has improved in the last 9 years. Okay? I can't assess that. I mean, there are some metrics I could look at. I could look at water advisories. I could look at some economic data, and I could make a very outsider data-driven speculation on that. but I can't actually assess that because that's not my lived experience. Okay. So maybe the answer is that the pieties and the genuflections do result in material improvements in quality of life. Maybe that is the case. But if they don't,
Poilievre's making an offer. It's a different kind of offer.
making an offer. It's not necessarily going to be the offer that came in the same package that it was with under progressive governments. But the fact that he's there is an attempt to build a bridge. Whether or not people choose to take that opportunity or not is up to them.
Well, we're talking about obviously,
and I can't judge people negatively or harshly for saying that the answer is no.
Yep, and obviously we're talking in this particular context about the Indigenous slice, but I think the Poilievre is not going to genuflect is probably a truism that a lot of people across the breadth of Canadian society should start figuring out.
This is not just for First Nations. He's not going to genuflect at a lot of crosses. And that's blowing some people's minds.
Yeah, minds are certainly blown. There's abundant evidence of that. Look, the last point on my list, and I can make this in a minute or so. If you gave me a straight up choice of voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I would vote for Joe Biden like 1,000 times out of 100. Not a tough choice for me. And I've always liked Joe Biden. I did watch that debate, and I've watched some of his press conferences since. He reminds me of my grandfather. I loved my grandfather, but it's not a flattering comparison in this situation. My grandfather knew when to give up his car. My grandfather knew when to give up his rifles. My grandfather knew when it was time to sell the house he loved and move closer to family because he was having a hard time remembering names and phone numbers. If it's a straight up choice between Trump and Biden, I park my vote with Biden, but I am not comfortable with what I'm seeing south of the border these days.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, too, is you have a lot of Canadians sort of looking up with waking horror about what's happening, especially since that debate. It's too late to get him off the ballot. Realistically, it can't be done.
It can be, but God, it would be nasty. Like, it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking legal challenges state by state to get him physically off the ballot. I mean, this isn't just a matter of the Democratic Convention will revolt. I don't think it's possible. Okay.
There's some kind of clause that could make it possible, but it would result in a completely chaotic convention. It's possible if Biden is pressured into quitting.
No, even if he is pressured into quitting or is named off the ballot, or he's pushed out of the slot at the convention, you still have to go state by state because he's now legally on the ballot state by state. So you need to put forward, I think, like legal challenges on a state by state level to get him off the ballot.
Oh boy!
I think it's actually too late, which is actually saying something about the American party system and the flaws of it, because you actually should be having the conventions before it's physically too late to get people off the ballot. The conventions shouldn't be rubber stamping processes, but they effectively are at this point. But that's another conversation. There's another sort of, how should I say this, column that is still very deeply fermenting in my brain about understanding the importance of generational turnover.
Yeah. And it's something the Democrats in particular should have learned after Ginsburg.
Exactly. But it's a deeper society level. Like when you get to be about past the age of 65, 70, your role in society changes, and it ought to change. You need to get your role in society has to be that at that age start to be about passing the torch on to the next generation and leaving it in a good condition for the next generation to take up. Your role in society is about being a valued elder, providing experience and mentorship to the leaders who come after you.
Not to
there
cling
has
on.
to be, you can't talking about politics. I think in Canada, we've actually done generational turnover very well, but I'm talking about in business. I'm talking about in how you function in your personal lives, how you manage your families. There's something, and I'm not going to blame all boomers for this because it's not all boomers. I know wonderful boomers who understand this and who really do value their role as elder members of society and understand this deeply. But there is something about the me generation that has not learned this lesson from their parents. And you see it in American politics. You see it in a lot of corporate world. Increasingly, America is a gerontocracy. That ain't good. That ain't a healthy thing. That's not a sign of a healthy society. A healthy society is that when you're the people who have the most experience and age reach a certain point,
they transfer
they understand.
They go golfing.
They have the wisdom and self-awareness to say, okay, who's 50 and coming up the pipe, and who can I pass this on to? Who can I convey my knowledge and wisdom to down the road, so that the society as a whole is better served by me passing that information along? There's a shift that has to happen. There's a mindset shift that has to happen, and I think boomers, particularly in the United States, are really struggling with this idea, and it's a problem. It's a real problem, because you don't want to die in these roles. That's not a good place.
You want to know what another problem is?
What?
My building contractors just arrived. I got to go.
Okay. Well, on that note,
but they are hardy and hale young people with many great years ahead of them.
Well, it's also a lesson for our generation too. We need to internalize this so that in 20 years we don't make this mistake too.
I've written a column about it. It's the example of Rush. They knew when they couldn't play at that level anymore, and they stopped touring. So,
on that note,
like Rush.
Be like Rush. Like and subscribe. Love the Line. Right. Come to www.readtheline.ca. Read all of our columns. They're better than our podcasts, actually, but whatever.
Oh, pretty good podcast, though. Have a great weekend, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Now is the time to modernize Canadian laws so that adult smokers have information and access to better alternatives. By doing so, we can create lasting change. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.